Good evening, buenas noches, and thank you for tuning in. On behalf of all of us at the locally based, independently owned bookstore, Books and Books in Miami, Florida, and in partnership with Fairchild Tropical Botanic Garden and Miami Book Fair, it's my pleasure to welcome you to a virtual evening with Dr. Cassandra Quave and Dr. Mark Plotkin to discuss The Plant Hunter, a scientist's quest for nature's next medicine, published by our friends at Viking. Dr. Cassandra Quave is the Herbarium Curator and Associate Professor of Dermatology and Human Health at Emory University, where she leads an anti-infective drug discovery research initiatives and teaches courses on medicinal plants, food, and health. She is also the co-founder and CEO/CSO of Phytotech LLC, a drug discovery company. A leader in the field of medical botany, she has authored more than 100 scientific publications and has been featured in the New York Times Magazine and BBC Focus, as well on PBS, NPR, and the National Geographic Channel. To moderate tonight's conversation, we are also joined by Dr. Mark Plotkin, who is botanist, traditional indigenous plant use with elder shamans of Central and South America for much of the past 30 years. He is president of the Amazon Conservation Team and the author of Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, Medicine Quest, co-author of The Killers Within, and most recently, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know. Throughout this afternoon's broadcast, you're invited to ask questions by using the Ask a Question feature at the bottom of the screen, and you can order your copy of The Plant Hunter from Books and Books below by pressing the green button. We appreciate each and every order and the generous donations from viewers everywhere. And now, without further ado, I'd like to welcome our guests to the virtual stage.
Hi, everyone. Buenas noches, Miami. It's great to be here. Hi, Mark. How are you?
Good to see you, Dr. Quave.
Great to see you. I'm so excited to be talking about the Plant Hunter tonight. Thank you for doing this. And Mark, you've been such an inspiration in my career. I write about this in the book, and when I was first learning about the field of ethnobotany, it was really your book, Tales of a Shaman's Apprentice, that introduced me to the field. And I owe a huge debt of gratitude to you for that, for writing that book. And it's really exciting to see the full circle come around, to be able to speak with you tonight about this amazing field.
Well, very shamanic. But I got to say, the ethnobotany world is all abuzz with your new book. So everybody is either devouring it or preparing to do so. And we're so glad to be able to do this with an independent bookseller and with Fairchild Tropical Garden, which is the crossroads of the tropical botanical world and the new world.
Absolutely. I mean, I have such a special tie with Fairchild as well. For the listeners out there, I actually did a lot of my training in taxonomy in the gardens. I mean, and there's no better place on earth, I think, to study tropical botany than at Fairchild. I mean, it was just such an amazing sensory experience to be able to go out and work with fresh materials in their collections. Just a beautiful garden. If you haven't visited, you should definitely go.
Definitely a global resource that everyone should visit, not just in South Florida. But I think if you live in South Florida and you're surrounded by such luxuriant vegetation, you're kind of spoiled to begin with. But people really need to know what a special place Fairchild is to the world at large.
Yeah.
So I would like to ask you, since we're getting started here, about how your book began, because people begin books in different ways. Sometimes it's happenstance, sometimes it's something they always wanted to do as a child, sometimes it just fell in their lap. So, when I go to book readings, book signings, I always want to hear the backstory. I want to read the book on my own, but I want to hear the story behind the story.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. Ever since I was a little girl, I dreamt of writing books, but I never really saw a path forward for that. And I mean, it really did in a way fall into my lap because, we do mixed science research. I'm a research scientist. I run a lab at Emory University where we investigate the medicinal properties of plants. And some of our research had gotten some press attention, which was amazing and very exciting. But then I started to get, email requests from different journalists. I was like, okay. And they wanted to follow me in the field. I'm like, I don't know about that. We're very busy in the field. But then I had a wonderful journalist that did follow us in the field, Ferris Jobber, who's just such an eloquent writer and an amazing author in his own right. And he this amazing profile on our research, and I had no idea about the relevance of what he was doing, and it just brought this amazing global attention to our work, and I was so thankful for that. And out of that attention came some interest about writing the bigger story. And so in a way it very much fell in my lap, but it was an opportunity I had to leap at. And it's amazing that we finally have a product. We have the book, The Plant Hunter, that's out now. It was some of my favorite plants. I've got St. John's wort and beautyberry and pepper tree, which are all species that I worked on in my lab. And it's been a lot of fun to share those stories of discovery with the broader public.
Well, I got a call this afternoon from a fellow at Harvard. They're trying to knit together a program on psychedelics and medicine, which, as you know, is a big topic right now. They're using these mind-altering plants and fungi to treat so-called incurable diseases like PTSD and depression with a lot of success. But I said to him, well, really, hallucinogens are not the be-all and end-all of medicines and potential medicines from the plant or fungal kingdom. So I'm curious as to your perspective as why there's so much interest now as compared to 10 or 20 or 30 years ago.
I mean, I think politics have a lot to do with it. There was this, horrific war on drugs where a lot of these entheogens were demonized. I think that there's been a lot of misunderstanding across not just hallucinogenic plants, but plants in general. We're so disconnected from the natural world today that people don't always realize that many of our modern medicines actually were originally discovered from medicinal plants that, by the way, were being used by indigenous healers for centuries, if not millennia. So I think there's a big disconnect in where we are in medicine today versus where we were in the past. And I think it's also important to realize that what I've learned, at least, and I think you've also shared this kind of perspective with the healers that you've studied under, Mark, is that medicine is about more than pharmacology. It's about the ritual and spiritual elements, the human connection elements, the connection with nature that really forms the true basis of what medicine should be.
Well, I think this shines through in your book, which is yet another reason to read it. And also, I want to recommend your podcast, Foodie Pharmacy, which is full of interesting people. But, I'm also doing a podcast now called Plants of the Gods, Hallucinogens, Healing, Culture, and Conservation. And I just completed a trilogy on marijuana and cannabis, where I talked about the fact that, much of the drug hysteria, reefer madness nonsense was about racism and about keeping people down, because marijuana entered the country through ports like my native New Orleans or Miami or some of the place on the Texas coast. And John Ehrlichman, I think it was, one of Nixon's henchmen, revealed at the end of his life, well, it really was never about the pot. It was never really about the drugs. It was just a means to bust anti-war protesters and Afro-Americans. And so there's a positive side to looking at this, and that is to seeing how these plants have influenced our culture, not just the chemicals, not just the alkaloids, but the effect on culture, plants of inspiration, plants of healing, sacred plants as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think in the United States, there's a serious disconnect. On one hand, you have a lot of cannabis growers and people that are making edibles and are making insane amounts of money off of this. In the meantime, we have many African American friends that are in prison because of the use of this or sale of this. So it's this crazy disconnect that's there, and this is an injustice. It's a racial injustice that has to be corrected, and this plant is deeply tied in this issue. Yeah.
Well, I think with all the positive attention that medicinal plants are receiving, your book being part of this positive movement, we'd look backwards as well and right some of these injustices in terms of people that are in jail for being busted for a joint, and plan for a better future, but also address the mistakes of the past. And I see that in your book as well in terms of bringing these new technologies to bear in ways we couldn't 20 or 30 years ago. So I think technology makes the medicine man more important, the medicine woman more important rather than less. There's a fundamental disconnect that people think, well, we've got all this great chemistry. Why do we need not only medicine people? Why do we need nature? We can just synthesize it.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the great fallacy where people don't quite understand. In order to synthesize, in order to drive these big AI initiatives, I get asked a lot about AI. AI is great, but you have to have starting materials to work with, even in AI. Where do you get those starting materials? You get them from nature. I mean, one of the great tragedies, I think, of modern medicine has been over the past 20, 30 years, really since the 1990s. We've made this shift away from the study of natural products, not just from plants, but also from fungi and also from microbes and marine organisms, and focused instead on combinatorial chemistry, which are basically lab made molecules. And let me tell you, those lab made molecules just pale in comparison to the natural products that plants and fungi and marine and bacteria can produce. I mean, they're structurally much more simple. They don't have the same types of activities. The reason I think a lot of scientists moved away from natural products during this period was they're really hard to study. I mean, it's really hard. And the technology is just now opening up that allows us to really begin to read the language of nature through advances in electron microscopy and electron diffraction, mass spectrometry, NMR. Like these are all like heavy chemistry tools that we're now able to deploy into separating, isolating, and really decoding the language of life. And I think this is a century that's going to go down in history as a century that we learn to start to read the language of nature. And this is, by the way, something that traditional healers, that shamans have been in tune with, not with these types of technological tools, but with the power of observation, careful observation, which is something we just simply don't do, I think, a lot in Western culture. We don't observe nature. We don't pay attention to things around us like they do.
Well, I agree. And to extend your analogy that nature is a library we can finally read, it's also a library that we're burning down at an ever faster rate. And what people need to understand is the cures of tomorrow aren't just in the Amazon rainforest where I work.
Mhm.
They're also in the Everglades. They're also in the boreal forest. They're also in the coral reefs. So this is not an issue of we just need to protect what we have here at home, but we need to think globally about this because that's the treasure chest where all of these weapons against these diseases lie. Another thing that I think is very important, and you make this point in the book, that COVID's not the end of the story. Okay, diseases emerge all the time. Nobody was planning for COVID when we were trying to find a cure for AIDS, and who knows what the next thing will be. So that once again we need to look backwards and forwards and learn from the past. And this learning from healers, and I'm not just talking about shamans in the Amazon. I'm talking about some of the women you work with in Sicily and other places who are knowledgeable people. I mean, when we read medical history, we read about William Withering discovering digitalis, but who remembers the woman who taught him that,
Yeah.
right? Or who remembers the woman that taught Edward Jenner about cowpox and smallpox? So once again, we've overlooked people either because they're women or because they're minorities or because they didn't have degrees. And I think ethnobotany is a profoundly humbling discipline when you find out that somebody who doesn't have a last name knows a lot more about pollination ecology and hallucinogens than you do.
That's such an incredible point. And I mean, that's a point I hope that if I have any students that are listening now, that they get this. Because I think that, especially when it comes to scientific history, there's so many details that have been written out of this. And one thing that I've learned in my journey in ethnobotany, at least, has been, a real lesson in humility. And I think if I've learned anything, is that I don't have the right answers, but more importantly, I don't have the right questions, and I may never have the right questions. But I believe that traditional medicine can lead us to investigate some of those questions.
Well, I got a paper today from somebody at Tulane, I'm sorry, at LSU in New Orleans, where they
Mhm.
were studying psilocybin for the relief of the symptoms of asthma. Okay. The point being that these are very biodynamic molecules and have important effects in the human body or the animal body, because veterinary medicine is in the billions of dollars, and that we need to think big here and we need to think holistically. And this goes to your point of let's not just think we need to find a molecule which cures drug resistant bacteria or cancer, AIDS, or COVID. We need to be looking more broadly. And the whole issue of admixtures is one which has been completely overlooked by much of medicinal chemistry. And now, like you said, we have these tools that we can look at it, understand it as never before. So in that sense, it's an exciting time.
Yeah. I also think, I mean, one of the things that really shocked me in recent years has been the revelation that, and I've looked at this in detail in the literature. We have 33,000 plus species that humans have developed understandings of as being useful for medical treatments across the globe. 33,000. But when you look at the scientific literature and you look at how many of those species have actually really been rigorously studied, I'd estimate that we're in the very low hundreds. We've barely scratched the surface of understanding the potential capacity of these plants that, again, that healers have known about for centuries or millennia, and science just hasn't really paid any heed to. And I think that, as you mentioned before, we're in a biodiversity crisis with climate change, with expansion of human populations. We're also in a linguistic crisis. We're losing languages and cultures and the knowledge of how to use these species. And that knowledge is actually really important to scientists because it helps us pinpoint and narrow down how to get at the molecules that are most relevant to those biological activities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Unfortunately, the system we live in is set up, it's like the anti-diversity system. I'll
Yeah.
give you a concrete example. I did a cover story for Herbalgram magazine on the history of medical wine. And I pointed out, from a conservation standpoint, relevant to what you're saying, is over 1,300 varieties of grape have been used to make wine. Right now, 80% of our wine comes from 20 varieties. So once again, we have 1,300 plus to work with, and we're doing 20. And if you don't think that's a problem, look at all the pesticides I got to put on the field and on the cornfields in Iowa, which is what happens in a monoculture. So we need to make space. We need to create a world that we're comfortable with diversity and not crowding out these cultures, these languages, these plants, because we do so to our own detriment.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think, we're going to be known as the era of the corn people when you think about archaeological history, like because corn has played such a tremendous, role in our diet, not just, and I'm not talking about eating corn as humans, but all the corn products are used in all of our foods, all the corn syrups and derivatives. And then, of course, the corn that goes into animal feed. Which of course is contributing towards biodiversity loss as we have greater expanding agriculture for animal rearing.
And
You
here,
know,
trying to get indigenous peoples in Mexico and Guatemala, where you have the greatest corn diversity in the world, to
yeah,
grant our super producing hybrid corn and losing that diversity, which is resistant to pests and diseases. I mean, we're fouling our own nest.
yeah. I mean, reflecting back on the book, I get into this section of my transition from, investigating ethnobotany, again, straight out of undergrad. So, by the way, Mark, I had no botanical training when I was in the Amazon. I mean, I just knew I had to go there. And a lot of that, again, was just stimulated by the book that you wrote. I mean, and after that, I met another scientist, an Italian ethnobotanist, Professor Andrea Pironi, who's really a world leader when it comes to the understanding of indigenous people's relationships with wild foods. At the time, he was a postdoc, and I was, fresh out of undergrad. And, I had this amazing opportunity to study how an ethnic minority group in southern Italy relates with foods. And that was so eye-opening to me. When you talk about, monocultures and our reliance on so few crops, in many indigenous societies across the globe, they do engage with many different forms of both cultivated crops, but also wild foods that expand their biodiversity. And these are foods that aren't necessarily palatable to the Western palate. They're very bitter, sometimes very sour. But they also happen to be, one of the consequences of that bitterness is they're incredibly rich in polyphenols and have off the charts antioxidant properties. And so this is why you see these quote unquote blue zones in the Mediterranean where people live, to be over 100 years old because they're eating these wild, very bitter vegetables that are just chock full of antioxidants. And it really opened to me, at least, the understanding of the importance of diet and health beyond medicinal plants to treat disease, but just maintenance of health. I think that's a really important area that plants can play a big role.
Well, one of the two recent episodes that I really enjoyed of Foodie Pharmacy was when you had those people on talking about fermented foods.
Yeah.
Will sauerkraut save the planet? And this is something that we look down on. This was a primitive food, this is a peasant food. And here the cutting edge of Western medicine is the human biome, which you find out we got to eat more sauerkraut. So it's
Yeah.
once again back to the future, which is a constant term in all ethnobotany, it seems.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and it brings me back to the work I've done in the Balkans. I mean, it's amazing to work with a group of people that are so resilient that they basically grow or wild forage all the food during the warm months because they have 6-month-long winters when they can't get off the mountain. So they have to have all their medicines and all their foods basically stored in their pantries, fermented or buried in the ground that they can then dig up to eat when it's time. I mean, it's just a tremendous example of the resiliency of the human race, and something that was really inspirational for me to think about, the role of these fermented foods. And I'm fascinated with fermentation. As you probably guessed, I have so many episodes on foodie pharmacology, fermentation. And one of our recent episodes on the gut microbiome, I think, really just got into the intricacies of how complex these systems are, and how we really just don't know how different microbes affect our health, but we do know that they are playing a really big role.
Well, one aspect of your new book that I find particularly appealing is that there's a Wizard of Oz element, because you keep going off to these wild and crazy places, whether it's the Amazon or Italy, and then you come home. But you learn valuable lessons on your trip, and then you come home. And that's part of the magic of ethnobotany. People think we go there to learn about these weird cultures, these so-called primitive cultures, and we find out how weird our culture is and how primitive our culture is. So that's a real eye opener, and that's sort of counterintuitive to most people think about ethnobotanists.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. I mean, I think on a personal level too, it's been a really interesting journey for me, both as a woman in science, but also as a disabled woman and a mother. I mean, being someone with a disability, for the audience that doesn't know, that hasn't read the book yet, I'm a below the knee amputee. I was born with multiple congenital birth defects in my skeletal system, which have made mobility a real challenge for me. I've battled infection throughout my life. I've battled surgeries. I call myself the $1 million woman because I've probably had $1 million worth of surgery done on my body throughout my childhood. But that experience, and then having that disabled identity in different cultures, every culture has a different reaction to the disabled. And in a way, I think that because I'm with healers that, have this immense empathy and work with people in pain. I'm also a person that has experienced pain, that live, with pain. And there's just a more, I think, in a way, a more immediate connection I'm able to draw, because we have this kind of common sense of like what it is to suffer and what it is to be healed. And it's been an interesting experience for me. And I've also really learned a lot about medicine from these experiences, because throughout my childhood I always thought of medicine as just being surgery and pharmacy, and that's medicine, right? But it was really in the Amazon when I was first exposed to kind of spiritual healing, and again later in Italy. We don't think of Italy as being like in Europe as being a place of spirit healing, but it very much is in some of these rural villages where you have these healers that treat, spiritually kind of transmitted diseases. And yeah, it's just been so in a way it's been a journey of academic enlightenment for me, but it's also been a very personal journey that's made it even special.
Well, I think that warrior spirit comes through in the book, and that makes it particularly appealing because it's a subtext rather
Yeah.
than the text. And I thought you dealt with it rather deftly. But that's why I think this book will have a long shelf life, particularly with STEM, where we're trying to get more kids interested in science. And, Scientists, unfortunately, are pretty good at squeezing the romance and adventure out of science. And
Yeah.
no wonder why people don't care, don't understand. So to me, it's important to publish technical papers, but to be able to communicate with the public and decision makers. Otherwise, the support isn't there. They don't understand the importance. It's just another expense. And I hope Emory realizes what a treasure they have in terms of this whole thing, because there really aren't enough centers in the academic universe focusing on this. Hopefully, there'll be more. But at this point, we're behind the curve. I mean, my buddy Tim Ferriss helped start the thing at Johns Hopkins. It took a guy who wasn't a scientist, who wasn't a shaman, to put this shaman's medicine on the therapeutic map. And
Yeah.
so you never know what it takes to make these things happen. And the nature of ethnobotany is odd bedfellows, PhDs following these pre-literate people through the forest going, what's this, what's that, what's it good for, how do you make it? I mean,
Yeah.
who's the teacher? It's obvious to us, may come as a surprise to some of the people who haven't had some of the same experiences.
Yeah, I think that's such an incredible point. And I think I read recently that Hopkins also got a big grant to pursue this line of study, which is tremendous. I mean, I think there's been so much skepticism in science, and this has been something I also read about in the book, about the challenges I've felt, at least when it comes to infectious diseases and the kinds of grants that I write, because I'm looking at plants for sources of new antibiotics. And the critiques I've gotten along the way are, number one, plants are too complicated. We've already looked at pharma's looked at plants, they don't want to look at them again. Or, these weird mechanisms that you're searching for inhibition of virulence or biofilm, which is basically the ways that bacteria can either attack your body or form a defensive fortress. Those aren't useful. Why are you wasting your time on these? And why, by God, are you looking at mixtures from plants? I mean, this has been an ongoing battle for me. And I've really tried to work hard to educate even other scientists about the fact that many of our medicines came from the plant world, and that we can actually learn a great deal from these traditional systems of healing, because we think about, modern medicine in the perspective of clinical trials that are run on people under these controlled standards, which is great. But the reality is, how do you factor in the scientific value of clinical trials run by healers, by shamans across the world that are using these plants century after century successfully to treat disease? We can't just discount those observations. Maybe they're not done under the standards of the paradigms of modern clinical trial, but those are still, I think, they're not just anecdotal evidence. There's real evidence there. And I think it's really arrogant to just dismiss things that we don't quite understand.
Well, I would argue that it's arrogance paired with ignorance, because in my
Mhm.
most recent book, The Amazon, What Everyone Needs to Know, I point out that statins come from fungi. And I have never met a physician who knew that. ACE
Mhm.
inhibitors, another billion-dollar class of drugs, high blood pressure drugs, come from Amazon snake venom.
Yeah.
So not only are they ignorant about the possibilities out there, part of that ignorance stems from the fact they don't know where the medicine they're using is coming from.
Mhm.
So it's a two-edged sword in a really negative way. I think, your book, some of my books, some of the lectures some of us give, podcasts, whatever, are aimed at having people realize the importance, not just for the future, but in past and present, which is
Yeah.
widely overlooked.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there's just so much promise there. And again, 33,000 species. And I'm just talking about plants. I'm not even getting to fungi or into other animal-derived medicines, which, expands that number, at an extravagant level. There's so much to explore. And one of the other challenges, I think, with the biodiversity crisis is when you look at the terrestrial hotspots of biodiversity, there are 36 recognized across the globe. These have, the to be a biodiversity hotspot, you need to have at least 1,500 endemic species. These are species only found in that one part of Earth. And you have to have at least 70% of your vegetation that's been threatened or has, been destroyed by modern development. So these are places that are both threatened and also rich in biodiversity. These places also, by the way, happen to fall in areas that are economically disadvantaged. And there are brilliant scientists there. I know you've worked with brilliant scientists in hotspots and with community members that are doing really important work in saving, tracts of land in the Amazon. The challenge is they don't have the economic infrastructure to do the science that's necessary to really understand how these plants work. And so, I mean, my vision for the future is really to establish a global network where these kind of research infrastructures with local scientists in these countries, so getting away from this whole colonial mindset of, the Harvard professor or the Emory professor, whoever goes into a place and like solves everything. No, I mean, there are brilliant scientists in these countries that can do a lot if they're only given the opportunities, the training, the access to the equipment that they so desperately need. I mean, and this is not just an issue for each of these countries. This is an issue for the world, because the entire global population will benefit from these scientific investigations. I know you've done amazing work in the Amazon with the Amazon conservation team in land conservation and working with encouraging transmission of knowledge, from healers to students. And we need more of that, but at a global scale.
Well, I think an aspirational goal for all ethnobotanists is to work ourselves out of a job. And I say aspirational because it's a goal I hope we never reach. But we've been very active and effective at training indigenous peoples to take control of their cultural and environmental destiny. For example, one of our signature efforts is training people how to map their lands. We don't map their
Yes.
lands. We train them to do it. So if you've ever seen pictures of guys in red breechcloths with GPSs, that's the guys we train. Now, we've done that with 90 different tribes, okay, and mapped and managed and improved protection to over 90 million acres of ancestral rainforest. That's measurable, but it's not enough. I mean, you got to map it, you got to plan it, you got to protect it. So we've also trained and equipped indigenous park guard force. Now anybody can do that and put a uniform on these guys with their emblem, take their picture, and put it on their website. But we've been doing this for over a decade. And when you can run a park guard force in the rainforest for over a decade, that's proof of concept. So clearly these goals are attainable.
Yeah.
But the question is, it's this race against time. To go back to your library analogy, we can read the book faster than ever, but we're also burning it faster than ever. So the race is clearly on.
Yeah. And I think there's a big difference. I mean, one of the goals of ethnobotany is to conserve knowledge. And a lot of us do this in the form of writing knowledge down and publishing it in scientific papers. And there are more and more ethnobotanists that are putting more efforts into returning that knowledge to communities in accessible forms, in their language, in ways that are accessible to them. But I think that recording that knowledge it's important, it's critical, but it's not enough. We have to not only preserve the knowledge, we have to preserve it in its living form, because traditional knowledge is dynamic. It needs to be alive. It needs to be in practice by local people. If you just relegate it to books or articles, I mean, it's destined to die. And I think this is one of the bigger challenges we face.
Well, that's why we realized at the Amazon conservation team that writing down lists of medicinal plants wasn't enough. Writing down the dosage wasn't enough. So we set up actual shaman's apprentice clinics. So they're not only collecting the plants, writing it down, figuring out the dosage, figuring out the diagnosis, but practicing the medicine. And that has taken off like a rocket. So yeah, it's got to be preserved in a living form. It can't be written down, and it shouldn't be written down for just for the purpose of showing off to your colleagues. Look at all this cool work I did. In fact, I don't publish this stuff. We did a book on the shaman's wisdom for the Trio tribe, published in Trio, possessed only by the Trios. So, if you want access to the knowledge, you got to talk to the Trios, but it won't be lost.
Absolutely. Well, this is something I get to in the book also, is this idea of, the Nagoya Protocol and the conventional biological diversity. And I'll tell you that, like, among many scientists, it's intimidating to think about how to navigate these international treaties. And at the base of these negotiations, it's really all about doing research in an ethical way, right? Just like you said, if there's knowledge that tribes don't want shared, don't share it. It's as simple as that. If there's knowledge that tribes do want shared, and in many cases, that is the case, because they want the knowledge to go on and they want it to be used. They want others to read about it. I think that we shouldn't be intimidated by these challenges, that we should embrace them and think about ways to really reinforce collaborative work. And that's where I really see the field of ethnobotany, also known as economic botany, going. I think we're in a whole new generation of collaboration with Indigenous peoples. And I think this is the time when we need it most because of the threats to both the knowledge and the biodiversity that we're facing.
Well, I find it frustrating when people complain about these international treaties. We wrote the Constitution hundreds of years ago, and we revert today, at least some of us. Uh, but that's where the amendments come in.
Yeah.
Okay. Things like giving women the vote, things like getting rid of slavery, all these adjustments were made to it, as well they should have been. So the idea that, well, something that was written once upon a time isn't working today, that's what you do with the written contract. All written contracts should evolve to meet the necessary conditions. And so that's my response when people say, oh, we don't need these treaties because they're out of date or they make things problematic. Well, then fix it.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think there are very clear paths forward. I guess one thing I'd like to end on, Mark, as I know we're running up on time, and I think we're going to have some questions from the audience soon, is I think it'd be fun to share our perspectives for like, what's your best advice for students that are interested in pursuing ethnobotany in the future? And I'll give mine after you.
Easy. Number one, stop complaining there's no jobs. Mushroom companies are being capitalized $3 billion with no product. Cannabis is the number 11 most important crop in the country, and probably number 2 if you add in the illegal sales. So the interest in natural products, new foods, new restaurants is exploding. And if you think that there's no bright future potential there, you're wrong. Keep an open mind and work with other cultures. The first thing you should be saying is, I'm here to listen and learn and help if I can, instead of give me the cure for diabetes because I got to go back and write my thesis in 9 months. That doesn't work. So in a job market where you're going to change jobs 7 or 8 or 9 times, unlike our parents or grandparents' generation, ethnobotany, which forces to learn something about language, something about culture, something about economics, something about biology, there's no better preparation for facing a world full of uncharted waters, which is where we are now.
That's amazing. I totally agree with everything you said. I mean, I tell my students this all the time. It's, in my classes I teach food health and society and botanical medicine and health at Emory. And, I tell them, maybe your future is not to become a doctor, but rather a city planner that includes edible forests in the city plans. Or maybe you're someone that goes into sustainable agriculture, or someone that, as you said, like can go into these new emerging markets for sustainable foods and exciting ingredients. I mean, there's so many different options out there. And my hope is that we'll have more people that are culturally competent, that have a love for the natural world, that can enter into fields like politics and governance, not just in the United States, but across the globe, because we need advocates for this earth. I mean, one of the things I tell my students too is, when we think about the health of the planet, so many of us are so removed from this idea of what's happening on the other side of the world, right? We think, oh, there's this disease outbreak on the other side of the world in China. Harking back to 2020. Something that happens on one side of the world can easily, move to the other side of the world in today's global economy. I mean, planetary health and human health are so closely intertwined. You can't separate one from the other. And so if you want to have a life of health, if you want your children and your grandchildren to have a future with health in the equation, we have to think about the planet. We have to. You can't ignore it. One cannot exist without the other. And I mean, I think that's my bigger message to my students is like, whatever job you go into, if you have this kind of multidisciplinary view on the world, you're going to be well prepared to do good for it.
Now it's my turn to say that I agree with everything you said. I'll add one quote to that before we get to the question. If Western medicine had all the answers, we wouldn't be having this conversation.
Exactly.
Okay. Western medicine has a lot of the answers. It's the most sophisticated system of healing ever devised, but it's full of holes. Pancreatic cancer, depression, Some of these answers are going to be found in these natural products in the Amazon and elsewhere. Some of these answers are going to be found in the heads and the brains and the hearts and the souls of these medicine women and men. And that's why we need more ethnobotanists. So let's go to the questions.
Absolutely. Great.
That was great. Okay, our first question is, what are you working on next?
Cassandra?
So I mean, I'm really excited about the work that my students are doing. So I have 3 graduate students in the lab, and one of them is working on the discovery of new antifungal drugs from plants. And, believe it or not, when it comes to antimicrobials, antifungals have been greatly neglected. The drugs that we have are really toxic to our bodies, and they're not very effective with some of these new emerging superbugs. So my student Lewis is working on that. I have my student Kate, who's doing amazing work on COVID. She has just completed a comprehensive screen of almost 2,000 extracts from our library, representing more than 650 medicinal plants used in the traditional treatment of infectious and inflammatory disease. This is going to be the largest test ever done on plant natural products, period, when it comes to COVID. She's narrowed it down to 3 extracts from 3 different species that have some potential activity. We're currently undergoing additional safety testing. We're undergoing additional testing in virus with collaborating labs, and I'm very hopeful about that. It's not been published yet, but I expect to be submitting that to publication very soon. And my other student is working on, herbal safety and how our livers metabolize different herbs that many of us consume. We have increased across the board, especially in the U.S., consumption of dietary herbal supplements. I mean, I think it was, you'll have to remind me, Mark, maybe, from Herbalgram, was it 17% over the norm of consumption of herbs? So we've really ramped up consumption of herbs, but yet many of those herbs that we consume as supplements, there's still data lacking on the safety of some of those. And so we're trying to contribute to that. So we're working on a couple of different projects, both in infectious disease, but also in herbal safety. We're also doing some work on pain in collaboration with our colleagues at Harvard, looking at hops. Because cannabis, unfortunately, is very difficult to study in a laboratory setting without a crazy amount of permits. And then we can only access certain forms of cannabis with those permits. And so we're working with a botanical sister to cannabis, working with hops and the terpenes that are found in hops, looking at their impact on pain. So we have some exciting work. Of course, COVID threw a lot of our work, kind of slowed it down. And I've had some of our team members leave to get amazing jobs. They're probably earning more money than I do currently. So we're kind of in a transition period, but a lot of really cool things. I think will be coming out in the lab in the next several months.
Well, I have to jump in here and point out that in my podcast episode on cannabis, I pointed out that hops, which is of course used to make the head on beers, and cannabis are the same family.
Yeah.
So it sounds more like a fraternity party than a botanical family.
I mean, our lab has smelled a bit like, if you have the isolated fraction of hops terpenes, by the way, it smells very much like cannabis. So it smells like somebody's been smoking in our walk-in fridge. It's kind of funny. Yeah.
Okay, our next question is, can you speak more about admixtures and what tests are used to understand how that works? I think this is extremely profound and totally under-researched, as healers rarely, if ever, use one herb alone.
That's a great question. Yeah.
Well, the most famous admixtures in the Amazon are ayahuasca. Ayahuasca is a vine and a hallucinogenic potion. And you never are given ayahuasca as a potion without at least 2 plants being in there, and often many more than that. But it's interesting that the 2 main plants, Banisteriopsis and another completely unrelated plant, potentiate each other in a completely unexpected and powerful way. So how indigenous peoples, what we once called primitive peoples, went into a forest of 30,000 different species and found out which 2 would have this powerful combination and powerful reaction is forever going to be mind-boggling. And the same can be said of arrow poisons, and the same can be said of many medicines where physicians often said, oh, these admixtures, these non-toxic plants, that's just indigenous mumbo jumbo, turned out to be, they were much better chemists than the professional chemists.
Absolutely. Yeah. Synergy. I think the synergy of these admixtures is incredible. I mean, and there's even synergy, within a single species. You in a single leaf tissue, you might have hundreds of molecules, and some of those molecules, work together, and that's how nature works. I think nature works in this way of kind of hitting one target and perhaps having another compound that assists in hitting that target, or hitting another target that eventually yields your desired phenotype. So I think this, on the scientific end, we've experienced great advances in the area of analytical chemistry. There are now, computing platforms that enable better understanding of network pharmacology, of looking at how different chemical scaffolds are related. And I expect this area to continue growing. I think we'll be able to dive deeper and deeper into this concept of admixtures in the future.
Thank you. Okay. Next we have, what's a good book / course / resource for a beginner wanting to learn about botany?
I would recommend, this is like a shameless self-promotion, but I would recommend both Foodie Pharmacology and the Plants of the Gods podcast as a place to start. I think those are both great places if you're an Audible learner, to get some exposure. I also have a YouTube channel called Teach Ethnobotany on YouTube. And there are lots of different resources on there. Some of my lectures, including other recordings of lectures given at different scientific conferences by different ethnobotanists, you could definitely turn to. I don't know, Mark, if you have some other examples of things we should recommend.
Well, I love the book, The Botany of Desire by Michael Pollan, which is written by a non-botanist. It's just very insightful. It's very fun. His writing is very enthralling. And the man's written enormous amounts of stuff, but that's my particular favorite. And when I talk to most people who seem to recoil at the idea of botany or reading anything about botany, and I recommend this book, they come around and say, that was great. What else you got?
Yeah.
My favorite book in terms of medicinal plants, particularly hallucinogenic plants, is Plants of the Gods by my mentor, Richard Schultes, co-written by Albert Hoffman, who invented LSD. It's really a feast for the mind and the soul, because it shows how most, if not all, religions have a basis in these altered states, which can be tied back to fungi and angiosperms. And it's only recently they found cannabis leaves in an ancient temple altar right near Jerusalem. They keep finding these indications of ergot in some of the early chalices used in Greek ceremonies like the Eleusinian Mysteries, or possibly even in early Christianity. And it just really gives you a major rethink in the way that these plants not only have impacted our religion, but, in The Botany of Desire, he claims that it's plants manipulating us.
Yeah, those are great examples. Great examples. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, this one is not a question, but this is our last comment for the night. It says, we need to incorporate traditional knowledge systems in our understanding of the natural world. It is great to see you, Mark and Cassandra. Esther, I'm sorry, I can't pronounce your last name.
Thanks so much. Yeah, I
Thank you.
completely agree. I think that raising awareness about the value of plants, the value of traditional systems of knowledge, is something I've become more and more passionate about. I think there's a rising hunger among the population to become more integrated with nature and to use herbs in healing, but there's a lot of misinformation out there as well. I think that, as scientists, we both face this challenge of really helping the public sort between fact and fiction. And it's important for listeners to find trusted sources of information around plants that you consume. Because not everything in nature is safe. There are lots of things that will kill you. Even medicines can be deadly if taken in the wrong dose or in the wrong context. And so there's a lot of amazing things about plants, but you also be very careful and get informed. And my challenge to all of the listeners tonight is really, one way to start in getting a relationship with nature started, and really to get on your own journey, your own personal journey to healing, is to make relationships with the organisms that are around you in your daily life. You don't have to travel to the far off Amazon or to the mountains in the Balkans or to Indonesia or these amazing places of biodiversity. You can walk out to your backyard or in your neighborhood. You can investigate some of the species, the trees, the shrubs, the herbs, the grass all around you. Learn their names. Look up on the internet how they might have been used in the past, and just get to know the creatures in your environment. And I think it will open up a whole new way that you can really experience the world.
Yeah, I of course agree with all of that. But to misquote my landsman Trotsky, he said, I'll misquote him by saying, "You may not be interested in disease, but disease is interested in you." There's all sorts of nasty critters, protozoans, bacteria, viruses that would just love to sink their teeth into us. COVID's not the end of the story, and the natural world is the best protection. Not only new medicines from nature, but living closer and more harmoniously with nature, so we're not cutting down the forest and they're jumping on our species. So I recommend buying The Plant Hunter. I recommend joining and supporting the Fairchild Tropical Garden. I recommend supporting independent bookstores like Books and Books, because all of these things are connected. This is what the shamans say. It's all connected.
Yes.
And our culture doesn't do a very good job of recognizing that, but let's hope we're coming out of that now.
Thank you both so much. This has been such an interesting conversation. I feel like I learned so much. So this has been so great to be a part of. And thank you everyone for coming tonight and joining us. And don't forget, you can buy a copy of The Plant Hunter from Books and Books' website or in person. And thank you just both of you for this amazing conversation. It's been great.
Great. Thank you,
Thanks
everyone.
for tuning in.
Good night.
Have a great night. Bye-bye.